constructive and analytic therapeutic processes. When 8 people are assembled in a group, it is natural that they approach each other in the usual way by talking, being encouraged to talk about everything as it occurs to them. It is likely that they will tend to talk about their symptoms, about their complaints. In some, as we know, these symptoms are per se behavioral problems. Shall we say, great difficulty to get on with the family, or inhibitions in working, or all kinds of social conflicts. In other cases, the symptoms take the form of complaints, physical complaints, all sorts of pains, sickness, apparent diseases. On the other hand, mental complaints like panic attacks, getting depressed, being unable to concentrate, having extraordinary fears, thoughts and visions. On our part, we recognize these symptoms, whatever form they may take, as the manifestations of mental conflict. These can only gradually be transformed into intelligible and meaningful communications. We do not necessarily assume that once these struggles can be deciphered as meaningful and therefore understandable, that they will then somehow disappear. However, it is true that as they become communicable, the other members of the group can become involved, interested, sympathetic, antagonistic, reacting in any way whatever. We know that all therapeutic factors, whatever their nature may be, can only operate under these conditions. A lot goes on in any group brought together under similar conditions, without any expert guidance. It is quite a new experience for many to think at all, but still more to think about their problems in the way that they now do. Moreover, to think aloud, indeed to tell other people about what often amounts to a very intimate part and aspect of their lives. This and the processes to which it opens the door are pregnant with therapeutic possibilities. It all depends on the atmosphere being basically receptive, helpful, and producing a readiness not only to talk, but also to listen and to receive other people's communications and give thought and feeling to them. There are a number of examples of group psychotherapeutic treatment where not much more happens than that the therapist allows this atmosphere to develop, supports it, and shares it with his own particular goodwill and sensitivity. This can happen with favorable consequences for the participants. Nor is it quite so easy as it sounds. For the therapist to cultivate such an atmosphere and to guide the group over its difficulties in order to maintain and further develop it. We early recognized the astonishing range of usefulness of such group psychotherapy, even without entering into any analyzing. and have called this the supportive, or better perhaps, the constructive aspects of such group meetings. This is what our groups share with all types of current and counter groups, more existentially oriented groups which have since sprung into being. I am far from looking down on these types of groups or doubting their usefulness. Some good leaders of such groups bring about constructive and even creative experiences. Thus, for instance, Iris Sanguiliano has described in Group Analysis, GAPAC, an international correspondence, which I edit, Volume 3, Number 2, how she treated a number of writers suffering from the well-known writer's block. They did not want to enlarge and concentrate on the reasons and causes of their disturbances, but instead to discover the process of creating. In doing so, they sometimes experience in the immediate present treatment situation how they themselves became blocked or even became a block. They found that the response of the therapist and their mutual response to each other resulted in a considerable improvement or a complete solution of their trouble. I mention this communication as a good and interesting example of what can be done without any or very little analysis. The only criticism I would make is that workers with this sort of existential therapy seem often to have, so to speak, an axe to grind with an analytic approach, which they seem often not to fully appreciate in its proper perspective. For instance, they speak of an endless recounting of causes and searches for solutions, as if that was the essence of an analytic approach. Well, it may be so in bad examples, but it is not so in a well-conducted group analytic group of the type I am talking about. In such a setting, all these different experiences, communications, in their various forms and divergent nature, are analyzed. That is to say, these reactions are subjected to a process which liberates their real primary meaning and place, and equally important, dissolves the powerful forces which keeps a person from being able to do this for himself. In more technical language, we are even more interested and certainly more active in the process of uncovering and unearthing the operation of the unconscious processes of defense and resistance, the unconscious operations of ego and superego, with a disastrous influence upon the maintaining of a morbid state. The individual, while apparently well motivated to overcome his difficulties, to know the forces counteracting his recovery at their real roots, is unable to accept help productively. The individual fights with the greatest tenacity, albeit unconsciously, for his own suffering, against his own liberation, not only from suffering, but the liberation of his own personal mental functioning. All people, to some extent, share these needs for self-punishment, suffering, self-humiliation, inability to accept their own success. There is a common denominator of fighting against change, against any change, as if it was a great danger. Any change of a deeper sort, a change of attitude, of the total meaning of one's own person and one's own world, seems indeed to be a danger. It is this common denominator of fear of change and unconscious fight, positive fight against change, which connects our difficulties in curing a person with those we encounter in teaching a person. As soon as this teaching involves a change of attitude, a giving up of old positions. The reason is that these old positions are deeply anchored in the powerful influence of the parents and parental figures from early childhood onward. Psychoanalysis allows us to understand these fears as based on unspeakably horrible expectations if such taboos are transgressed. It is these which quite unconsciously make it true for the individual that such a change is dangerous. The other analytical activity is that of undoing distortions, of throwing light on symbolic expressions, of elucidating the real meaning of what seems absurd or completely senseless behavior and experience. This other side, difficult and important as it is, causes us much less trouble in groups. The reason for this is not easy to explain. I believe that above all we have to remember that apart from a conscious response, conscious interaction, there is a much larger and more powerful section of unconscious communication. The group, under group analytic conditions, demonstrates this beautifully, especially to an experienced, psychoanalytically trained observer who knows what levels of libidinal or of ego development are involved, however far removed from each other the different manifestations may be. In the more individual sense, the reactions and repercussions take place on different regressive levels, different characterological levels, different levels of defense, and so forth. The interaction between these different responses takes place unconsciously and transpersonally. The reactions colored by what is activated in the individuals concerned. I've spoken of this as resonance, and it is very helpful to observe the consensus, however unconscious, in which key each communication is received and reacted to at any given time. There is a tendency to focus more sharply on certain levels which become shared ways of understanding what is going on. The therapist must be on guard not to introduce his own expert interpretations into the group prematurely or indeed at all, even in his own mind. constantly accept the material as presented by the patient as his guide and for his orientation. In his inner psychopathological vocabulary, he is familiar, or ought to be, with the dynamic structure of symptoms, whether they are in the nature of psychosomatic expressions or of conversional hysterical expressions, or in whatever form. Sometimes, descriptively, the same label could be applied, say, a phobia or a phobic reaction. And yet, the depth and meaning of that reaction is quite different from one to the other occasion. A strong paranoid reaction may be involved in one case, panicky or depressive one in another, and so forth. If we say that these different communications are nevertheless valid, that is to say, operating, however unconsciously, and have a receiving station and a responsive station in every individual's mind, then it follows that the group itself can do, and in fact does, a lot of analytic work. It is hardly necessary to try and help it in this, and can be and should be very economic with interpretations. It is indeed justified to act on the conviction that this group of people who are mutually involved have in principle a much better knowledge of what is going on than has the conductor. In a way, the conductor's mission is not unlike that of the writer or poet, who, while he does not invent or produce the life of his day, the minds of his contemporaries, nevertheless has a special gift to express back to people what they actually have taught him or showed him. Some of this gift is hopefully present in the group analyst, who is in a privileged position to understand sooner and more readily than the others what is going on. He should not even try to be too helpful, even if he always could be so. Insofar as it remains of paramount importance that the group be actively engaged and regain and enlarge their own trust and confidence in their ability to understand and to solve their own problems. It is not too much to say that ultimately this leads to the greater liberation of the individual member and his capacities, and above all, his creativity. As I said before, it is more important for the conductor to attack more actively the unconscious counteracting, destructive forces which the group presents. They will not in the same way, as it were, look after themselves, and their elucidation, the working out, the overcoming and conquest of them remains of the greatest ultimate importance. From what I have said, it should be clear that we are concerned with each individual, but that we have to orientate ourselves and understand what is going on from the total context of the group. This is true of any situation, of any psychotherapeutic situation. Our frame of reference is always the total situation. This has led me to perceive and formulate that the context in which we move is in fact essentially the intrapsychic, psychodynamic shared group context. This seems to be difficult to accept. We are so concerned with the individual and his unity that we feel frightened to accept such a concept, as if the uniqueness of the individual was doubted. Of course, we have culturally inherited this attitude, and it is also contained in the theories and concept formations of psychoanalysis. At this point, we have definitely to transgress psychoanalytical concepts. It is difficult, so it seems, for people to understand that such an attitude is entirely compatible with the highest respect of the integrity and uniqueness of the individual. If we treat a group as a group for its own sake, the matter is somewhat different. If we treat a group which has a function or task to perform in view of its functioning as a group, then indeed we put the group context and the actual group into the foreground. But even if such groups improve, the individual members also benefit greatly. But in the group analytic group of which we are here talking, our concern is solely and wholly with the individual. These are two different compartments of the total process, which I have called constructive ones and those which I have called the analytic ones, go in fact hand in hand. I hope that it is very clear that we help the process of communication and sharing, and we lend strength to all the constructive processes by enlarging the field of their operation and by eliminating the dangerous, pathological, destructive forces. It is these that maintain the status quo actively and that try to undermine any attempt at change, however desirable for the individual it might be. The fight against liberation and improvement of our patients is also supported by those of his intimate network, whose equilibrium becomes automatically disturbed and threatened when our patient, one member of the network, begins or threatens to change. Group analysis has brought into the open this multi-personal nature, or as I put it, transpersonal nature of neurosis. In fact, in our opinion, of all mental processes. This is at the root of family therapy, really of the whole group network theory of neurosis. When I grew up and matured, it was looked down upon for a psychoanalyst to practice anything but the pure classical method of analysis. The suspicion was that he would otherwise lose the clearness of his perspective and conviction and mix things up. In my personal convictions, let me make clear, I have never ceased to be a psychoanalyst and as such to practice psychoanalysis proper and unmitigated. This is not to say, of course, that my approach did not develop in that field also. Nevertheless, new principles of approach and using new theoretical concepts has never led to confusion in my case. Indeed, the overall truth that holds good in all situations, certainly in all therapeutic ones, stood out more clearly against the relative truth which is more apparent in one situation than the other. It helped me a great deal to concentrate all my thinking on the differences of the processes in the group setting from the ones in the two-person setting, and particularly the specific psychoanalytical setting. As a psychoanalyst, one avoids meeting any of the patient's family or friends, as you know, if possible, absolutely. This is as it should be, having in mind the concentration in the psychoanalytical situation on the transference situation, and therefore the need to keep this transference situation aseptic, to keep it free from contamination through other contacts. By the way, the analyst's reluctance to disclose himself in any way possible as a person in his private circumstances or in his personal opinions or feelings has the same reason, namely to give the patient's fantasy and the patient's transferences the freest possible play. Contrary to what one might have expected, the much more personal contact which one has with patients in a group setting actually diminishes the more or most primitive, fantastic levels of transference just through the personal acquaintance and, as it were, everyday-like contact with the therapist. It does not reinforce the matter and fixate the patient on this transference relationship, but on the contrary, it modifies it in a more realistic sense. This is, of course, a double-edged fact insofar as we can not in the same way, in the same intensive and extensive way, analyze the most primitive levels of the individual transference situation and transference neurosis in a group as we can in the individual situation. There are, however, other equivalent compensations for this. We could, in any case, in a twice-weekly group of 8 people, for sheer lack of time, not hope to do the same intensive individual transference analysis as we can in the individual daily situation. Nevertheless, what we are talking about are the special new elements which the group situation in turn introduces. Having just touched on the network, which of course is originally the family group network of each individual, normally, we will say a few things on this also as an example of the totally different and in some ways more effective view and approach we get to such a situation through treating the whole group together. In this case, a natural primary group. About the same time when I first turned my attention to the treatment of patients in what was to be called group analytic groups, I also began sometimes, in suitable cases, to see patients' families or other important persons instead of avoiding this, as the psychoanalyst rightly does. From what I have said, I hope it is quite clear that these were not patients which underwent a regular psychoanalysis with me. Strangely enough, I did not then see the important bearing that one set of experiences has on the other, and to that I will now turn. Let me first recall one of my first such experiences in family treatment, as it later on began to be called. A man was referred to me with impotence. It turned out that his wife was the sister of the wife of his own twin brother. Both these families lived together in a friendly relationship, quite by themselves on a remote farm. You can imagine what degree of intimate and complicated interaction had developed under these circumstances. After seeing this man 2 or 3 times, it became clear that his brother's wife, the sister of his own wife, was a key figure, and I asked him to bring her along. Fortunately, this was a very successful interview, and this sister-in-law was extremely understanding and cooperative. I had after this to see my patient only once more, when his impotence had disappeared. By chance, I could check after considerable time that all had remained well. It must be understood that to treat this patient in isolation, especially by orthodox psychoanalytical methods, would have taken a very considerable time, even if we assume that eventually the result would have been not all my experiences were as successful as this one, but whenever I used this method, it proved extremely helpful in throwing light on the total situation and its implications, on what change could be at all expected, and what was necessary to effect such change. I am sorry to say that in many cases I had opportunity to see and examine very many restricting and limiting circumstances against any radical change were revealed. Even though I think such information is extremely important, saves much time and unnecessary trouble, and also guides treatment into more appropriate channels. It is today well known that such family relationships are of decisive importance, and a number of authors have produced evidence that they are productive of individual patients' disturbances, even so it appears in the case of schizophrenia. Such information should also be of decisive value for the prospective psychoanalyst. I mean, for the psychoanalyst who intends to undertake the analysis of such an individual patient. Maybe In such a case, the investigation of the family network should be carried out by someone else. Here is a brief example of what I mean by the prognostic and diagnostic importance of such an approach. A young schizophrenic who had been in and out of hospital since his youth, and he was now only in the beginning of his 20s, was referred to me as having much improved in hospital, and that he might now be able to return home to his parents. He was the only child, provided he had adequate psychoanalytical treatment. I saw him first with his mother, who brought him along, arising from which I had to see the mother several times, and also once or twice the father, when the following dynamic situation had become quite clear. The parents' marriage had its own severe problems, but they both found it impossible to face having their schizophrenic son at home. However skillful one's analytic endeavors with this patient might have been, it is clear that one would be up against an insuperable obstacle in trying to help him, as of course the boy wanted nothing more than to be at home with his parents. Actually, as often happens, I saw this family part of the time, altogether not very long, each alone or two of them or all three of them. Actually, the father cut the matter short over the financial issue, insisting that he could not foresee the exact duration of this treatment. It was impossible for him to be responsible for the son's treatment. The parents sent, as I heard later, the son back to another psychiatric hospital, further away from home. By the way, in this, as in a number of other cases, I found, possibly accidentally, the father more of a disturbing schizophrenic element than the mother. But in my view, it is always the whole family group which operates. Later on, I took occasion to examine the current network of each individual member of an ongoing therapeutic group at the Mainz hospital in order to verify my conviction that every single person is modeled and shaped deeply by an interdependence with his network. I prefer to call this network rather than family, because many times people who are not family members are very important factors in such network, or networks in which the patient lives and on whom he depends actually and psychologically. Even animals and even inanimate objects can form part of such a network. What this discovery meant in the first place was that such a group of reference is far more actively important than we were led to believe in classical psychoanalysis. In classical psychoanalysis, it was assumed that such importance is almost entirely due to repetition, re-establishment of childhood circumstances, or to a regressive return to the libido to them. There is no question, and it is continuously demonstrable, that these current difficulties, as far as the individual is concerned, have their roots in the early original family group, and are in that sense transference and repetition phenomena. Looking back after many years of work it has become very clear that this network theory of neurosis is a most important fact in the understanding of our therapeutic procedures, especially in the group analytic group. It is in fact these three areas which stand out in group analytic treatment as far as the individual is concerned, namely his original family network, which has given him his shape, his reactions, has conditioned him all through. The way in which he now lives in his current networks, or a number of networks which overlap, or which are kept strictly apart, and the way in which he repeats these reactions in the treatment situation by way of transference and repetition. If the patient is taken out of his network, as happens in any treatment of an analytical kind, and in our group analytic groups, he is unable to orientate himself in any other way than by behaving as he has been doing, and by hook or by crook, trying to re-establish the conditions and responses which he vitally needs. He will do so often against all evidence, as it were, and it is then that the compulsive and repetitive character of his transference becomes particularly obvious. Thus, the group analytic situation makes manifest the most salient and compulsive parts of his transference reactions particularly clearly, sifts out particularly clearly what is compulsive and anachronistic in them. Having thus been led to consider the patient, as it were, the symptom of a disturbed network interrelationship, we can ultimately be led to the conclusion, which seems unusual, but very likely correct, and that is that all we understand as mental processes, what we understand as mind, as experiences, are multi-personal events. In claiming that these processes go right through the individual, I spoke of transpersonal processes. It is as if X-rays penetrate the apparent borders between individuals who, physically, being separate entities, mentally are in constant primary contact with each other. As I said before, our groups are exceptionally composed of really basically not interdependent people to start with. Now, what about this then? How can there be a firm common ground which precedes the individuals composing this common ground? Well, the concept which proves useful here is that of the group matrix. You could not indeed likely form a group, at least not one which could be analyzed, by the participants themselves out of people of a different species, or people who talk a different language, or people who have grown up in totally different cultures, nationally, and as far as class and tradition is concerned, and so forth. So, in fact, the groups we put together bring with them a considerable common ground pre-existing any of their interactions. This has been called the foundation matrix. On top of this, the individual group itself develops an ever-increasing common ground of understanding, of culture, of knowing each other, of expectation. It develops memory, it continues to be affected by what has happened in the past. All this is the dynamic matrix, the specific matrix of the group. It is useful to think of all the processes taking place in between members as occurring in this communicational web. It is also inside this matrix that one can look upon the processes going on in such a group as principally always involving everybody, though not to the same degree. And it is useful, and I think also corresponds to observable fact, to think of the manifest occurrences, of the manifest events, as the figure, as the foreground, and of the invisible, often unconscious, latent part as the background, both together only forming a meaningful configuration. I have tried in this talk at least to touch on some of the new concepts which seem necessary for an orientation in this new field, and on the way in which facts and theories from psychoanalysis become modified and transformed in this new medium of study, the group.